Welcome classic rock fans to another episode of Classic Album Review, classic albums that excavated and explored. And today we're looking at The Winds of Change by the Animals, or should I say Eric Burton and the Animals. It's an interesting phase for this band. By 1967, that rich R&B combo that had caused the world to shudder with their very visceral rendering of the folk standard House of the Rising Sun had long gone. They'd be reconfigured, remoulded in a totally different image. Of course, the Animals, or Eric Burton and the Animals, or Eric Burton and the New Animals, as they were sometimes called, were a new incarnation who was shaped to reflect Burton's interest in LSD and experimentation with psychotropic and psychedelic drugs, but also his love of that counterculture that was emanating in a fog from Haight-Ashbury. I once said American psychedelia was the real deal, and English psychedelia was far too whimsical for me, too concerned with sprites, gnomes and teapots and things like that. But the American stuff I felt was the real deal. I've had to think about that after listening to this album, although it has to be said, of course, that this album is inspired by Eric Burton actually going off to the USA and imbibing that culture and the drugs associated with. So it doesn't really feel like an expression of English psychedelia to me. This album, of course, does mark that shift, the first album that marks that shift from being an R&B combo to a band moulded in the same shape as bands like Country Joe and the Fish and Grateful Dead and Jimi Hendrix, of course, bands that Burton greatly admired. Of course, he does two more albums in 1968 that are in very much the same vein, but it has to be said that the couple of albums that follow this one are much better in terms of the way they're considered, and they're not so drifting and formless. Of course, in terms of psychedelia, you had bands like, the Grateful Dead, Country Joe and the Fish, and Jefferson Airplane. But it has to be said that these bands are still operating very much within the paradigms of folk and blues. For me, it's a band like 13th Floor Elevators, with Rocky Erickson wailing away like some lysergic James Brown, and Toby Hall on that devastating electric jug that provides that a tremulous sound that for me underpins that whole psychedelic movement. Of course, by the late 60s you started to get what we called the Boss Town sound as a kind of a counter-reaction to what was coming from San Francisco. And you had bands like Ultimate Spinach, for example. But of course these albums are very much of their time, and the ones that are very much of their time almost become unlistenable. The Ultimate Spinach being a prime example of that. Their album comes across as just or the first album anyway, it certainly comes across as just a formless drone. So in 1967, pioneering R&B singer and Geordie Boozer Eric Burton discovers psychedelics. Sometimes this music on this album sometimes feels like a cross between the Grateful Dead and the Likely Lads. Interestingly, of course, he dedicates this album to George Harrison, if I'm not mistaken. He very much wanted to embrace that Hindu philosophy that Harrison and the Beatles dallied with. Harrison continued to embrace. In fact, Burton obviously cites the Hindu faith, meditation, and of course drugs as being very much an inspiration behind this record. Of course, this album was recently re-released in this box set, Eric Burton and the Animals When I Was Young, the recordings from 67 to 68, and it contains The Twain We Shall Meet, which came out the year after Winds of Change, and it's a far better album, by the way. Followed by, of course, Love Is, as well as it also contains the mono version of Winds of Change, which is quite interesting. The reason I like sometimes the mono versions of these psychedelic albums is due to the trippiness of them. They like to experiment a lot with stereo panning, which just becomes absolutely irritating to the modern listener. This album is really a throwing open of those doors of perception. There's a rich tapestry of colour and psychedelic splurge. He employs a lot of the psychedelic tropes associated with this period, ultimately dating this music terribly, I think. For example, we get sound effects of waves washing over the title track, sitar, electric violin. They sound a bit cliched now, of course, and obviously vocals that are heavily drenched in reverb. A poem by this is a perfect example of that. It's a recitation by Burton swirling with echo-drenched instruments and sound effects. Of course, the famous one on this is the very free-form interpretation of the Stones' Paint It Black, A call out has to go to John Wider, who plays electric violin beautifully, which complements the guitar work of Vic Briggs on this one. It also includes some wonderful vocal improvisations from Burton, which has the song drifting well away from the Stones' original. And in fact, the band was so pleased with their rendering of this number that they performed at the Monterey Festival. By far one of the most bizarre pieces, shall we say, of psychedelia on this one is the Black Plague, which is a grim, melancholic, mournful number, very reminiscent of the Yardbirds' Still I'm Sad. This song just feels like a platform for Burton's surreal and psychedelic ramblings. And the album has quite a few tracks like this that makes it quite a difficult listen. However, there are more conventional numbers on there, like, for example, Good Times in San Francisco Nights, which which are great songs. I think they were singles as well. Burton's love of that counterculture music was apparent. He was a massive fan of Jimi Hendrix, and in fact, this album contains one of the psychedelic era's first answer song titles in his response to the Jimi Hendrix famous song "Are You Experienced?" Of course, Burton's is "Yes, I Am Experienced," and it's almost like he continues this dialogue between the two artists. The structure of this album is interesting as well. It's divided into two distinctly different sides. As one critic has actually pointed out, you get the first is more conceptual and ambitious psychedelic mood pieces, and the second is comprised of what one might term as more conventional songs. But the opening track of this album finds Burton regaling us with a history of rock and roll over some very Eastern-tinged psychedelic background. And it's a far cry from the Animals of old, of course. The original line of the Animals were long gone by then. I think Chas Chandler was managing the Jimi Hendrix Experience. And Alan Price, who actually gets mentioned in the dedications of this album, who was the core member of this band, organist, I believe, he'd left it a year prior to this record coming out. And even Eric Burton himself was somewhat preoccupied with his solo record, Eric Is Here, an album that spawned a modest hit, Help Me Girl. But I'm fascinated with this period of music, I must admit, and the use of LSD in the late 60s was like some counter-insurgency against the mores of Middle America. And the use of LSD challenged people's perspectives, certainly artists, their perspectives, their philosophies, politics even. The Vietnam War, of course, was raging at the time, and a lot of the bands felt that the counterculture was a movement against that. Let's not to forget there's a lot of people that took long, strange trips from which they never really effectively returned. Syd Barrett was, I think, an acid casualty. I think his LSD use exacerbated perhaps schizophrenia that was already apparent, according to Roger Waters. But there are other examples, of course. Peter Green didn't fare well, of course, and the guy from Moby Grape, I can't remember, Skip Spence, I think it was. He was another casualty of the whole sort of acid thing. But with this album, of course, we get the new formation of a new Animals and a new label, MGM, of course. And they were produced by Tom Wilson, who had interestingly worked with the Velvet Underground. But the cover and the title of the album speaks of this very whimsical, transient idea of something not being fixed, which is very much in keeping with the time, of course. And there's a text written on the front cover which feels very much like a manifesto. I love you all and want you to gain something from these new sounds as I gain from listening to my saints in past years. If you feel alone and confused, unhappy, discontented, just know that there are many like me love you, and maybe you'll know why. I am happy, contented and unconfused. The games I play are mostly games of children, not all happy games, games of love, games of mystery and games of wonder. The Winds of Change lineup included Danny McCulloch, bassist, drummer, Barry Jenkins, Vic Briggs on guitar and piano, and future family member John Wider on, I don't know how to pronounce that right, on guitar and violin. But by the time this album was actually released, Eric Burton was living in the USA. Of course, this album is dedicated to a whole spate of musicians that Eric Burton feels provide the platform for where he is now. Musicians that helped him to expand his own parameters. And expand the parameters is exactly what Winds of Change does. In fact, the opening track is like this melange of sound, like a psychedelic soup. We get droning sitar, violin. It's all very hypnotic. It's almost you could imagine it sort of re-emerging in the later 20th century as dub or trance. But the atmosphere evoked by the opening track of this album and other tracks like it add to a disorientating effect, a formlessness which is very much in keeping with the time, of course. And it builds to a sense of exhilaration, which finds its full expression in their rendering of Painted Black, which Burton himself has said that it was born out of exhilaration rather than anything else. This album not only is influenced by psychedelics, it also makes lots of numerous literary and philosophical references. Very much of an album of its ilk. It does tend to meander and drift somewhat, and the listener finds themselves losing patience with it, I think, but nevertheless it's a meaningful piece of the Burton jigsaw, so we say. It is a transitional record of note, a period piece if you want, but I don't imagine many will be listening to it these days, apart from people like myself, of course, who really digs this trippy shit. 1968's A Twain We Shall Meet, like Winds of Change, evokes a very specific mood, of course. You get the recitations, the trippiness and the personalities, but I have to say it's a lot more focused and overall a better record. It contains the absolutely gorgeous number Orange and Red Beams, which is a beautiful song. Go on to YouTube and check it out, it really is a great tune. But it also has the Soaring psychedelic anthem Sky Pilot, which is a masterpiece of atmosphere, composition and arrangement. Listening to Winds of Change now, it feels like a bit of a beast of burden, no pun intended. But it works well, I think. It works well within the paradigms of 1960s psychedelia. It is, of course, sprawling and feels very spontaneous. And as I said, the second album was definitely better. In fact, one critic has called this record a bunch of Brits pretending to be Americans. Yes, that's true, but that could be said of a lot of the bands in the 1960s. The Stones start to... the Stones were a band that were born out of emulating that classic American blues. And certainly by the early 70s, Mick Jagger has assumed a sort of an American drawl to his accent when he sings. Especially if you compare it to bands that I consider to be quintessentially English. I mean, bands like the Kinks, for example, have a very English sensibility about them. And Jethro Tull, who, after they move away from their blues phase with the first album, become more universal. But nevertheless, the lyrics and songwriting quirks of Ian Anderson are atypically English, I believe. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there and allow you some space and time to go and check out this album. I would, of course, like to thank you for being a Patreon and continue to support my channel in this way. It means a lot to me. Anyway, thank you for watching. Do stay safe, but more importantly, please do keep listening.